tell you about it because we can embellish the stories a little bit. We'll just tell you briefly about the purpose of the SR-71. The SR-71 was one of 4 Blackbirds that were built. There were 3 other versions, but the SR-71 is the one that got most of the notoriety and people are aware of. It came about during the Cold War. It was a need to obtain intelligence information on potential enemies or known enemies or threats. It was designed in the early 1960s. And for some of you will not even know this term, but the engineers that designed it for the most part used what's called a slide rule to do all the calculations. How many of you have never heard of a slide rule? Yeah, I'm sure there are hands that would go up if you're really honest. So the slide rule technology that they built this airplane with, and it did remarkable things, Now, the resolution, we call it, you can take pictures and radar images. You can literally see the lines in a parking lot from 85,000 feet away with the airplane traveling 3 times the speed of sound, and yet the cameras are so good you could see those kinds of things. One of the engineers who worked on the cameras once upon a time, his name was Don Burns, and Don told me that one day everything was absolutely perfect on a test run they did, and they could see a golf ball on the green of a golf course from 85,000 feet, Mach 3. They could see the golf ball. He didn't know if it was a Titleist or a Callaway, but they could see the ball. So just did some amazing things. Now let me warn you that as aviators, we use acronyms. If you catch any of us using an acronym, please shoot your hand up and make sure that we explain to you what that acronym is so that you don't kind of wonder what's that all about. Now I'm going to have the panel introduce themselves, but before they do, I want to tell you something about each one of them just very briefly. On the far end is Don Campbell in the red shirt. Don Campbell is Mr. Maintenance for the SR-71. Nobody in the Air Force knows any more about the SR-71 and its maintaining it than Don Campbell does. He was a mainstay in the program for over 20 years, Don? 26. That's over 20, isn't it? Now, next to Don in the, what color shirt is that? I don't even dare say it. The pink shirt is Al Payne. Al's known for the fact that he built all the bars in our BOQ building, our Bachelor Officer Quarter building in Okinawa. Don built all those bars that people enjoyed and used so much for so many years, and Don, we thank you for that. In the blue suit next to Don, as you go from your left to right, is Ed Yielding. Ed's the one that came from Alabama to come and be with you folks today, and what an effort on his part. But I need to tell you that Ed Yielding is the guy that flew the airplane on its last official mission, last official flight. He flew it from the West Coast to the East Coast in 1 hour and 8 minutes, minus a couple of seconds. It's the airplane that sits at the Udvar Hazy Center in Washington, D.C. And along the way, he set how many new speed records, Ed? 6?
4 records.
4. Well, 6 is better than 4, so it's okay if we embellish. Set 4 speed records on the way from the West Coast to the East Coast, and then parked the airplane at Dulles Airport, where it went into the Udvar Hazy Center, which is the annex to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. As we continue down the row, next to them is Pat Bledsoe. Pat Bledsoe was another record holder. He holds the record for speed in a closed circuit, 2,000 and just under 2,100 miles an hour. 2,091 or 98 or
92.
92, 2092, but who's keeping track, Pat? Who's keeping track? But 2 world record holders sitting on the stand in front of you. Next to them is Frank Stamp. Now, Frank and I are dressed alike, not because we intended to, it just works out that way. Frank and I were crewed together for 4 years on the airplane, and that's his claim to fame, is he put up with me for 4 years and he survived. We showed up last night in the hotel and we were both wearing yellow shirts. We hadn't talked about it before. We show up this morning, we're both wearing coral, is the color that we choose to call it. We're wearing the coral colored shirts, and then as you keep coming from your left to right, then I'm next. And my claim to fame is that I put up with Frank for 4 years, and so it's kind of a little bit of, give and take here. Well, let me have the panel members now just tell you briefly about themselves as we start with you, Don, and work this way, and then we'll go from there.
Well, that's a tough one. As he said, my name is Don Campbell, retired chief, 26 years SR-71 program. Just a highlight of my career. Never been a dull day. And retired, went to work for Lockheed Engineering on SR-71 of all things. And so, And retired from that, now retired totally. I do a few speaking engagements. Live in Chico, California. That's it. Everybody.
Can't hear you. Can't hear you, Al.
Hit your button. Right here. Turn it green.
Anyway, I'm Al. Oops, I am. One more time. I'm a pain in the butt. No, anyway, I was one of the original crew members and flew for over 930 hours. And I left to go to school at the Air Command Staff College, and after that I came back to Beale as an RSO again and flew again, which I am the only one that did that. I flew another 4 years and became the Director of Operations and retired in 79. Was a contractor for 25 years building houses, and now I'm fully retired.
I'm Ed Yielding from Florence, Alabama. Flew the SR-71 for 6 years from 1983 until it retired in 1990. Loved every minute of it. It was a great assignment. I flew the F-4 Phantom for 9 years before I flew the Blackbird. And after the Blackbird, I flew VIPs out of Washington in the Gulfstream 3 for 5 years, and flew for Northwest Airlines and Delta Airlines until I retired, and I live in my hometown where I was raised in Florence, Alabama.
I'm Pat Bledsoe, originally from Arkansas, and I was in the next to the last class of pilot aviation cadets. Right after I graduated, or 6 weeks after I graduated, they closed down that program, so all people going through pilot training had to be officers after that. But I started off as 4 years as a flight instructor in training command, and then went to Vietnam as a forward air controller flying the 01, and returned from that to Air Defense Command, where I flew the F-106 for about 6 years, and then went to the SR-71. There for 7 years until I went off to Washington for charm school, and then to Columbia as the air attaché. When I came back from that, I went back to Beale again as the deputy commander for operations of the wing, and then I retired from the Air Force in '85 and became an airline pilot and flew for Alaska Airlines until I retired for the second time in 1999, and my wife and I have lived in Prescott, Arizona ever since, just enjoying life.
Oh, good morning. My name is Frank Stamp. I got interested in aviation at a very early age. I grew up in New York City and went to an aviation high school there, and then from there went on to get a degree in aerospace technology. But a few months from graduation from college, I was sitting in a fluid dynamics class with a slide rule in my hand, listening to a professor that I could hardly understand, and I said, "Frank, you don't want to do this for the rest of your life because I'm not smart enough." So I went down to the Air Force recruiter that very day and signed up for delayed enlistment. And when I graduated from college a couple months later, I went into the Air Force. After being commissioned in January '71, I graduated NAV training in '72 and went to the RF-4, the reconnaissance version of the F-4 Phantom. Great mission, did that for 7 years, 1,600 hours before I got accepted into the SR program. That's where I met Gil, and we had a great time flying together. Let's see, I left there in '83, went to a couple of staff assignments and retired from the Air Force in '93, went into the defense contracting business, and then retired after 12 years in the nonprofit business working with homeless families. And I'm now fully retired for the last 3 years, and I'm a lot better at being retired than I was at working.
Well, and as I said earlier, my name is Gil Bertelson. I spent some time as an instructor pilot in both T-37s and T-38s. I began that career in a place called Laredo, Texas. Has any of you ever been to Laredo, Texas? Well, I know that when I die, that my wife and I know when we die we're going to heaven, we spend our time in hell. In Laredo, Texas, there was one tree in the entire town, and that tree is dead. And I went from Laredo to Mount Home, Idaho to fly the F-111. And there's not a lot of difference between Laredo, Texas and Mountain Home, Idaho, other than the latitude and the longitude. And there's one tree in town, and that tree is dead. And I spent a couple of other tours on the F-111, one in England, one in Thailand, and then went to the SR-71, where I was there I flew the airplane for about 4 years. Then I went to Hawaii to serve on a joint staff assignment in Hawaii. Went back to March Field here, actually, to be in the 15th Air Force for a while. And then I went to Provo, Utah, which is my hometown. And I went to Provo, Utah to be the commander of the Air Force ROTC program at Brigham Young University. And after I retired from the Air Force, I stayed on at the university for a few years. I worked in their business school as an administrator. And now I'm retired, fully retired, and I spend as much time as I can fishing and playing golf. And when I think back on my entry into the SR-71, one of the requirements, a couple of the requirements were at the time that I applied, you had to be short and you had to be dumb. So Frank qualifies in both categories. For me, they said because I was so dumb, they could waive the height requirements.
Yeah, but at least I didn't need the waiver.
Well, having said all that, what I'd like to do, maybe if this is okay with you, is have each of the guys tell something briefly about maybe something very memorable to them in the SR-71. And then we do that, we'll throw it open to any of your questions. And remember, there are no off-limit questions, there are no dumb questions. Be happy to respond to any question you have. And if we don't know the answer, I guarantee you we can make something up, so you'll think we did. So, okay, Don, you're on again.
Okay, I told this story the last time we were here, but it's so memorable. I can't even say the word anymore, so it's worth repeating. We had an aircraft aboard for a generator loss going to MacDill Air Force Base, Florida, and I took a recovery team from Beale Air Force Base in California to go down and get it. And the logistics tail on the SR-71 recovery is quite tremendous. They wanted to fly what we call a hot flight out of there, so we had to take our own liquid nitrogen. And it took 3 KC-135s to carry the equipment. One KC-135 with enough fuel on it to refuel the SR-71 to get off the ground, and another one to do an in-flight refueling after it got off the ground. So everything was going along fairly well, and we were getting ready to launch out on the day we were supposed to go. And the tanker that was going to refuel the SR-71 on the way out lost a generator. And so he couldn't go anywhere. We looked all over that part of the United States looking for a generator, couldn't find one, so created quite a dilemma. The aircraft that we've got that's got our gas on it can't fly. So there's some peculiarities about the fuel we use on the SR-71, and it has some properties in it that are not kind to containers and rubber hoses. And if you take a brand new fuel hose out of supply and put JP7 fuel in it, the JP7 eats the elastomer lining out of the inside of the hose and contaminates the fuel, and you can't use it. The only way that you can cure that is to fill it full of fuel, let it set for 24 hours, take it out, flush it 3 times, do a sample flash check on it, make sure it works okay. What that means is I can't use anything in MacDill Air Force Base to transfer fuel from that KC-135 to the SR-71, so I had a choice to make, and that choice was to make the SR-71 into a fuel pit or a fuel truck. We took it over to one tanker, filled the SR-71, we already had fuel in the SR, so we took it over to another tanker, pumped the gas from the SR-71 into the tanker, which is the first time we'd ever done that. The crews in the tanker says, "My God, can't you slow that down?" The SR's got some pretty good boost pumps. And so we had to repeat that process using the SR-71 like a fuel truck about 3 times. And it was quite embarrassing. I equate that to using a Ferrari for delivering newspapers or something, So anyhow, it was quite a challenge, but it was very memorable. So whatever, there we go.
Done?
Go ahead.
Yeah, probably the most interesting and memorial thing I've ever done. We'd just gotten home from Okinawa after a 6-week tour, and on Friday night, and then Saturday night, one of our pilots got sick. They were supposed to take the SR back to Kadena on Tuesday morning. And so Maury and I had just gotten home from Okinawa, so we didn't disrupt anybody because we were going on vacation. And we took off Tuesday morning at 11, arrived in Okinawa at 6 a.m., 7:30 a.m. on Wednesday. and then flew an operational sortie on the way over for 5.5 hours. After we got there, we flew 2 sorties on Thursday and Friday. Then Saturday morning, we took off at 6 a.m. and arrived back at Beale at 7:30 Friday night. We flew 16.5 hours flying time, 2 op sorties. It was pretty exciting.
Well, we took a lot of pride in our missions. We felt like we were doing something really important for our country. A lot of our missions were out of Mildenhall, England. We flew out of Okinawa, Beale Air Force Base, and Mildenhall, England. In Mildenhall, we had a lot of sorties up north around the Arctic Circle, keeping a close watch on Soviet submarine bases and other defense installations up there. And it was especially interesting in December. My first flight up into, one of my first flights up into that area was in December of 1984. And we weren't concerned with where day and night was because our primary sensor at that point was the SRs, which meant we could take pictures with a radar and get imagery almost as good as we could with an optical camera. So we used the SRs a lot because it made it more useful. We could get good pictures at night and through weather also. So we weren't concerned with where day and night was. And in December, along the Arctic Circle, the day-night line runs almost east and west in places. And on this particular mission, it was just a coincidence that my reconnaissance track crossed the day-night line 6 times in less than an hour. And so in less than an hour's time, I'd seen 3 sunsets and 3 sunrises.
Well, one of the more interesting missions I can remember is I was flying with my longtime RSO, Reggie Blackwell, and we had a mission where we took off from Beale and landed at Kadena, but did some reconnaissance along the Siberian coast on the way over there. And we did one refueling right after takeoff and then another one off the Aleutian Islands. And we knew the temperature was forecast to be a little bit above standard at high altitude that day, and the airplane is very sensitive to temperature at high altitude. It can drastically affect your fuel burn rate. When we left the tanker off the Aleutians and climbed up to altitude, it was so hot, 20 or 25 degrees above standard, as I recall. We were about 10,000 pounds short on fuel by the time we leveled off. So we started wondering if we were going to be able to make it all the way to Kadena. We considered diverting into Yokota Air Base as we passed Japan, but we knew that was not really politically acceptable. The Japanese didn't want us there. So we calculated that as we went further south, the temperature got cooler at altitude, so we were able to make up a little bit of fuel. And I need to explain that the airplane used a fuel-air heat exchanger for cooling. And normally it worked very well. But that day we got so low on fuel before we started the descent that the fuel-air heat exchanger was not working that well anymore. And by the time we got ready to start our descent into land in Kadena, we were down below 10,000 pounds fuel remaining, which is where you normally land. And because the fuel by then was so hot, the fuel-air heat exchanger was almost not working at all. It got up to about 175 degrees in the cockpit. Our outer coveralls were starting to smoke. And we both had plastic checklist holders that just shriveled up into a ball. And of course, as soon as we started our descent and started slowing down, then the airplane started cooling off. So by the time we landed at Kadena, the temperature in the cockpit was almost back up to normal, or back down to normal, rather. But that's the only time I worried about actually burning up in the airplane before we got to land. We touched down, as I recall, with about 4,000 pounds fuel remaining, which is almost flame out time. So,
Wow.
That's one I really remember.
That's memorable.
Yeah, as Gil mentioned, he wanted us to give you some memorable experience, and unfortunately, the older I get, I can't remember which was the most memorable. They all pretty much blend together as being amazing from one end to another, but Pat just reminded me, Gil and I had kind of the opposite problem with extremely cold temperatures at altitude, flying up in the northern latitudes. When, as Pat was saying, when it's hot comparatively outside the airplane, it doesn't perform as well and it burns a lot of gas. But when it's cold, the airplane is just screaming like crazy. We took off and to go to one of the missions that Ed was talking about up near the Barents Sea and near the North Pole. And we didn't realize the temperatures were going to be as cold as they turned out to be when we got to altitude. But as Gil started the acceleration, we both commented that, boy, we're climbing like the proverbial bat out of hell, and the airplane was really making up some speed and altitude quickly. Finally, we get to the point where Gil started pulling the throttles back to level off at Mach 3, which is what the profile for that mission was. And we were ready to slow down and level off, but the airplane wasn't. And the airplane just kept accelerating and climbing. And to most people, that would sound pretty neat. You know, that's really cool that the airplane just wants to keep going. But you do have some parameters that you have to stay within for controllability of the airplane. Because the air starts to lose so much density, you just don't have a lot to work against the flight controls. So I'll let Gil tell you how he finished that one out. I told you I don't remember it either.
So is that a handoff? That's a handoff, okay. Well, I was going to talk about sunsets, and Ed did that. I was going to talk about cold temperatures, and Frank did that. And but I'll just kind of pick up on the story about the cold temperatures just a little bit. The standard temperature is supposed to be minus 56 degrees centigrade. That's theoretically the standard temperature in a mass that starts at 35,000 feet and goes up to, I don't know, the troposphere or someplace. And we had a way to kind of, in the cockpit, kind of interpolate. Didn't get a direct reading, but we could kind of guesstimate as to what the outside air temperature was. And I don't remember what the gauges were, but anyway, there was some way we could do some computation. And we're supposed to be minus 56 degrees centigrade. We calculated that day that it was about minus 80 degrees centigrade, 20 degrees colder than what it normally would be. And Pat ended up being low on fuel because of the very hot temperatures. We ended up 12,000 pounds more fuel than we were supposed to have when we got to the next tanker to do the refueling. And as Frank was talking about, the airplane didn't want to slow down. I mean, I literally took the throttles and pulled them back as far as I dared. You have to stay in afterburner when you're at altitude. And I pulled them back as far as I dared. I took a hold of what's called the Baylor bar on the helmet, pulled my head down. You didn't have a lot of mobility. Pulled my head down so I could see where the throttles were, and I got them as close as I possibly could to coming out of afterburner. And then I tightened down what's called the throttle friction knob, so the vibrations from the airplane can't allow the throttles to move. I didn't want to come out of afterburner, so I tightened it down just as tight as I could, and then we just hung on. And I don't remember what the speed ended up being. I think it was about 310 or something like that, or 312. We were scheduled for Mach 3, and that was as slow as we could go that day. We could not go any slower than that in that cold air. And the other part about that particular mission is that we used to report to the weatherman after we'd land on our weather debriefing when we began to leave a contrail on the climb out, when it stopped, and on the descent when it started and when it stopped. As we were climbing out of England, I look in the periscope, a little thing up here, I could look back behind the airplane, and I looked back in the periscope, and at 13,000 feet, we started to leave a con. Neither of us had ever seen that before, and we'd flown in England a lot. He was in RF-4s in England, and I was in F-111s in England before we got to the SR. So we started conning at 13,000 feet. Kept climbing, and Frank kept saying, have we stopped conning? No. We stopped conning? No. At 85 to 87,000 feet, we're still leaving a contrail as we're flying along the Russian coastline. Went up into the Arctic Circle, came back around, and flew through the contrail that we had left about 30 minutes earlier. It was still there, and we flew back through it and looked down on our left side, and here were a bunch of contrails coming up to meet us. And so in the intelligence debriefing, we talked a little bit about these contrails coming up to meet us, and the intelligence officer says, no big deal, they do that all the time. A MiGs of some sort that they launched out of Murmansk, we figured they were doing practice intercepts on us. But anyway, on the descent, the same thing happened. We did not stop conning, leaving a contrail on the descent until we passed 13,000 feet coming down. Just an amazing day, and that airplane was just, we get it in cold air, and it's just unbelievable. And you'd think minus 56 degrees is cold air, but not cold enough for the airplane. It would like it better. Okay, the floor is yours now. Please, now what I'd ask you to do is, if there's a particular panel member that you'd like to direct a question to, do that. If not, just throw it out as an open question, and between us we'll figure out who's got the best story to tell about that, or who can make up the best story about that. Floor is yours. Please, over here.
One of the things I heard that just sounded amazing was, the missile was shot up at it, and it just kicked on the burners and left it in dust. And I was wondering if anybody experienced that could tell about how.
Where's ED? Did he leave? We have one of our guys is here who was the last person to have a missile fired, a surface-to-air missile fired at him. Oh, there he is. ED, what are you doing? Oh, never mind. Anybody else want to address that, though, the missile firing? Pat?
Well, yeah, one day over North Vietnam, all our warning lights came on to tell us that they were locked on and shooting missiles at us. And it was one of these days that was much colder than standard, which I didn't stop to consider before the next action. When that happens, your procedure is to accelerate and climb. And we were already at about 3.15 Mach at about 80,000 feet. So Reggie told me all the lights are on. It looks like they've launched. Okay, so I eased the throttles up to maximum afterburner and raised the nose a little bit. And instead of watching the gauges like I should have, I was looking out the windows to see if I could see any missile contrails. And the next thing I know, Reggie says, "Pat, where are we going?" And I look back at the gauges and we're passing 3.37 Mach and 87,000 feet, and it's still just accelerating to beat the band. So I eased the throttles back to minimum afterburner, and we settled back down to where we should have been, because the normal maximum Mach was 3.2. We were allowed to go to 3.3 if we needed to, and had a good reason, like they're shooting missiles at you or something. But the Lockheed aerodynamics people told us that anything past 3.3, you're asking for trouble, because if you have any sort of aerodynamic upset or an engine inlet unstart, you can lose control of the airplane. And I noticed that day it was starting to feel a little bit squirrely, but nothing happened, thank goodness.
We used to have a motto that said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for I'm at 85,000 feet Mach 3, climbing and accelerating." Question back here.
Wasn't a missile fired at SR-71 when Egypt was friendly with Russia?
I don't know about that. Anybody aware of that?
Remember that, Tom?
Not right offhand, no.
The last one we know about was, hey, ED, will you raise your hand? Hey, ED, raise your hand.
I'm sorry, what's the question?
No, just go back to what you're doing. I just want people to see you. In August of 1981, ED and his pilot Maury Rosenberg were flying across the Korean demilitarized zone, and the North Koreans that day decided, why don't we push this button and see what happens? So they fired an SA-2 at him. The U.S. News and World Report magazine came out the next week with a picture of the SR-71 on the cover, and the caption said, "A spit wad from the north," which is basically all it was. So, what are you saying, Jerry? There were three? Three, wow. Story gets better every time. Next time it'll be 4. Another question, please. Please, right here.
Yeah, I was actually a photo of church from the SR-71 back in the first mission to Vietnam. We used to watch the SA-2 talk to see it. Well, I was going to say we could watch the missiles climbing up through the clouds towards your airplane, but then you get to see the thing just drop over. It's like they couldn't get there. We saw it on the early missions, 1, 2, 3, 4 of those missions. After a while, it looked like they stopped trying anymore after that, though. But it couldn't get that high, could it, the SA-2 at that time?
Well, yeah, if you compare the performance charts of the SA-2 with those of the SR-71, you'll see that the only way they had a realistic chance of hitting us is if they launched a missile before we came into radar range. So obviously that didn't work too well.
Yeah, the SA-2 missile was above 70,000 feet. It was just uncontrollable. So once it got there, and then plus it was flying at Mach 4. We were flying at Mach 3, and there's no way you can catch it.
Next question. Did you already ask one?
No.
Okay, go ahead.
I've read things about SR-71 leaking fuel due to thermal expansion. I was wondering if you have any.
It's just a story. Don, I think you need to talk.
There's a truth and falsehood about that. The aircraft does expand 3 to 5 inches in length and width due to the heat. There are many things built into the aircraft to compensate for it. If you look at the corrugated wings, they're there to allow for heat expansion. There's the actual heat expansion joint where the fuselage and wings meet. But the biggest reason for the fuel leaks is that no chemical company was ever able to come up with a sealant that would withstand the heat in the wing tanks. The wing tanks of the aircraft were the first ones to go empty in flight, and it would just heat soak, and it would burn the sealant up. The more you flew it, our Okinawa short sorties were probably the worst because it got hotter on descent, and just burnt the sealant up in the fuel tanks, and it leaked, and we'd have to stop, reseal them. They'd be okay for a while. The longer you flew them, the worse they leaked. I hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, that when it grows in length and width, the fuel leaks stop," but they don't really. So.
Nobody ever flew formation with us to verify what it was.
And it doesn't help also. You pressurize the fuel tanks up to 3¼ psi with nitrogen pressure, and so if you have any kind of leak or seepage, it really pushes it out pretty good. But it's really not an issue. The worst leaker that we had in the entire history of the program, I've got pictures of, was 8,000 pounds an hour.
Did you add some, Frank?
Yeah, another aside about the fuel leaking that Don was just talking about. Gil and I were getting ready to fly a mission out of Okinawa once, and it was a little bit different than standard. We were going to take a slightly heavier fuel load, I think about 65,000 pounds, and it was the middle of summer. It was really hot. Those factors really kind of combined to put more, I don't know, pressure's the right word, on the fuel that's in the tank. That's probably not the right word, but it would cause the leakage to be more pronounced. When I climbed up my part of the ladder to get into the cockpit, the seams of the wings on the top of the airplane, fuel was just spurting out of the top, like about 16 inches or so up above the wing. And I looked down at the crew chief, and he looked at me, and he just shrugged his shoulders. What you could do about it?
Can I add something to that, Gil?
Sure.
To give you an idea of what it's really like, especially at Okinawa, the longer that we flew the aircraft that were stationed in Okinawa, our first rotation was like 1 year, and then we kept a couple aircraft for 2 years. Man, by the end of that 2 years, they were leaking pretty good, and we started this aircraft with what we call Buick Start Carts. They're 2 high-performance Buick engines with straight exhaust, and the most amazing thing that you'll ever see in your life is having an SR-71 sit in a hangar with probably 1/4 or 1/2 inch of fuel on the hangar floor, and you start these 2 Buick engines with headers on them, and there's blue flames coming out of the headers blowing the fuel off the hangar floor. That's how safe the fuel is.
Oh, Ed, go ahead.
I'd like to add something about the fuel. Since the airplane got so hot in flight due to friction with the air, the skin would average about 550 degrees temperature on the skin. Well, they didn't want the fuel to start burning in the fuel tank. So as we burned fuel, that space was then occupied with nitrogen. So we carried a couple of bottles of liquid nitrogen, and as we burned fuel, the space in the fuel tanks would then be taken with that inert nitrogen so that the fuel wouldn't start to burn in the tanks. But also, we had a special fuel that had a real high flash point. And even though we'd go out to the airplane, a big puddle of fuel underneath the airplane, they said you could just throw a match in it and we'd put the match out because it had a real high flash point. I never did actually try that, but that's what they said.
You know, I have tried that. We used to do demonstrations with the fire departments, and we would go out, and it's really some amazing stuff, because you understand what I'm talking about if I say propagation rate? Everybody knows what that means. You know, you light something, and, you know, you take avgas or automobile gas, you throw a match on it, and poof, you know, your car and everything around it's engulfed in flames. And if you can get the JP7 fuel lit, it's a slow propagation. You'll get you put some chemical triethylborane in to light it, And you see a flame come up, but then it's got to heat the fuel up next to it to up like 160, 170 degrees before it'll catch. So the propagation rate is just real slow. And you can have it on fire and you can take your hand in the fuel and splash it and put it out. I mean, it's that slow of a propagation rate if it catches on fire.
Just a little follow-up while we're talking about the fuel systems. Because it had that high flash point, you couldn't start the fuel burning when you crank the engines up. You couldn't get the fuel burning with typical glow plugs or spark plugs or whatever things they used to use in other engines. We had to have a chemical that would ignite the fuel. The chemical was called triethylborane. We referred to it as TEB for short. And on each engine of the airplane, there was a TEB tank that contained 600 what, Don?
CCs.
Anyway, 600 something cc's of TEB. And every time you'd move the throttle from off to idle during the start sequence, a little bit of this TEB would be released. TEB is so volatile, by the way, that if you had a bottle of it, you took the lid off, it would explode just coming in contact with any oxygen. So the TEB tanks were tightly sealed. When they'd fill the TEB tanks, the fire engine would come out, they'd have their fire hoses pointed at the airplane, the firemen would be in their silver suits because they don't want to have an accident. You know, if a little of the TEB got to escape during the downloading, you could have a fire. Anyway, very, very volatile. So in the start sequence, you get the engine turning over with the Buick engines, the airplane engine turning over with the Buicks that Don talked about. At 1,000 RPM in the cockpit, I'd take the throttle from off to idle. There would be a little spray of this JP7, kind of like coming out of your hairspray can, and a release of TEB. The TEB would come out and explode because it comes in contact with oxygen. It would be hot enough that it would start the fuel burning, and now the fuel would maintain combustion. Same thing in the afterburners, lighting the afterburner. A spray of JP7, a release of TEB, and then the afterburners lit. Okay, enough on fuel. Anybody, next question? Over there on the corner.
Question for Yuli there. You flew the final flight from 972 to the Smithsonian, and that's sort of a bittersweet thing. Can you talk about your thoughts during and after the flight? How that's done?
Well, let me try to repeat that. Ed flew the 972 on the final flight, and then the rest of the question was just asking what he experienced on that flight?
Exactly.
This is the airplane that flew into Dulles Airport and then was retired into the museum. And so, yeah, Ed, tell us about it.
Okay. Well, first of all, it was a huge honor to get to fly that flight. Really, any crew member that was checked out on the airplane could have made the flight because it was all done within flight manual parameters. So it was just in the right place at the right time, so to speak, to get to fly that flight. Extremely fortunate for it. So on March the 6th of 1990, we were to take the airplane to the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian wanted us to do a coast-to-coast speed record when we brought it from California to call the public's attention to what a great airplane it had been for our country for 25 years. So the purpose of the record was to call attention to the airplane and as it went into the Smithsonian. So to do a coast-to-coast speed record, you've got to start out over the Pacific. So we took off from Palmdale and we flew 200 miles out over the Pacific Ocean and joined with a couple of KC-135 tankers and got a full load of fuel, lit the afterburners and got a 200-mile running start to the coast. To do official records, the NAA is the agency that verifies and establishes official records. So the NAA had representatives on each coast and in several cities along the way for our city-to-city records. So we took off at 4:30 in the morning, refueled in the darkness over Pacific, and we'd refueled at night many times. Lit those burners and accelerated to the coast. And I'll never forget what a beautiful sight it was crossing the west coast. It was twilight by then, and you could see the white ocean breakers all along the California coast. We were really high, so down below I could see, it was still dark enough that I could still see all the millions of lights of Los Angeles down below, and even to the north I could see San Francisco, and to the south all of San Diego, and beyond San Diego is the blackness of Mexico. And then a few minutes later, we're flying east toward the sun, so and faster than a rifle bullet. So the sun is coming up really rapidly, and pretty soon it's daylight. We're at our cruise speed. We had permission to fly at our maximum speed of Mach 3.3. That's the flight manual top speed of the airplane, so we had permission to take it to the top speed. We've flew Mach 3.3 then all the way across. A few minutes later, I see Las Vegas, and then I see the Grand Canyon, and we passed right by all those majestic mountains of Colorado, and I'm really reflecting, this special flight. Thinking about what a great country we have, and as we passed Pikes Peak, I remembered that Catherine Bates was inspired to write that great song, America the Beautiful, from Pikes Peak, and thought about what a great country we have, made great by the hard work and sacrifices and prayers, courage of our forefathers. Looked down at all that farmland, hundreds of miles of farmland, and thought, man, just 150 years ago it was taking our brave pioneers months to cross country that we were crossing in just minutes, And on the eastern part of the country was all undercast, and so I didn't see many features over the eastern part. But JT and I just made sure we had one last great look at God's earth from 80,000 feet, the curvature of the earth, and a bright band of blue on the horizon, the darkness overhead because we were above 97% of the air molecules, real dark overhead. And thought about how fortunate we were to have served in the Blackbird, along with hundreds of other highly dedicated men and women over those that served in the Blackbird program. And then when we crossed the East Coast, no airplane had ever crossed coast to coast across our country faster than the Blackbird did that day, 67 minutes and 54 seconds. We did a descending left-hand turn back to Dulles and made a couple of passes for the crowd that had assembled there, and lit the afterburner on one of them to show them that beautiful sight of the shock diamonds and that orange flame coming behind the airplane, and feel the power of those engines. And that particular picture was on the front page of the Washington Post the very next morning. That would be March the 7th, 1990. And they had a nice ceremony as the Air Force passed the airplane to the Smithsonian. But anyway, it was just a huge honor to be part of that. And like I say, any crew member could have done it, but I was just lucky to fly. And very fortunate to fly for 6 years. Just loved it.
Thanks, Ed. Douglas.
Tell us where the name Habu comes from.
Where the name Habu comes from. I've got no idea. I have no idea. Al,
Yeah.
tell them where Habu comes from.
When we first went to Okinawa, the locals said the airplane looked like a habu, which is a snake, a deadly snake over there. So then it just became the name of the bird for years after.
So you see on some of the patches, if you see on Ed's left shoulder here, he has the Habu patch. That's the patch you got to wear after you'd flown your first operational mission. Up until then, you're just kind of a neophyte, and you're just kind of in training mode. And once you flew your first operational mission, you were one of the guys. They gave you the secret handshake. We got the tattoo on the bottom of the heel of our left foot, and and we got to wear the Habu patch. And so it's kind of a badge of honor. And again, the airplane, that long, skinny black nose sticks out there that the Okinawans just thought there was a semblance of reminded them of their steak, which was indigenous to the island of Okinawa. So they'd point up and say Habu, and so somewhere one of our early guys heard that, and that kind of became the unofficial nickname. The first time I saw it, I thought it stood for high altitude bomb unit, but I knew that it was an unarmed airplane, so I didn't know where. Please, question right here.
Oh yeah, there's this TV program on now, fictional, I think it's called The Americans, but it's about Russian spies in Washington. I think it's set in the 60s. I was wondering if there was ever any attempts to, like, people getting to be friendly with the pilots and try and find out something. I mean, were they warned all the time, that blonde might not really like you, she just wants to know what you know?
Well, I know the blonde didn't like Frank, and she came around anyway. Well, the question had to do with whether or not, as crew members, we ever kind of tried to be enticed by Soviets who were trying to get secrets out of us one way or another. And I don't know, any of you ever experienced that?
Well, yeah, when we went to England and showed the airplane for the first time at the Farnborough Air Show in 1974, our wing commander, Pat Halloran, warned us all that if you if any good-looking people with accents come up and want to get to know you, you check it, send them to me first, and I'll check them out.
We were obviously be aware of the fact that if any good-looking women came to entice us, they had to be on the paycheck. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it with us. So it's,
When we first went to Okinawa in '69, there was a gentleman there who was writing a book about B-52s. And he invited us out to dinner, and there was about 6 of us, I think, that went out. And we were really worried. We asked our division, everybody, about should we not go or don't say anything. Or, it was just completely off the wall. He just wanted us to have fun. And his 2 children went to school and ended up in the United States going to school. So we weren't sure what was going on.
well, I guess that's our experience with this spies. In the back there, please.
Yeah, how'd they come up with the name Blackbird? And is it true that Kelly Johnson modeled the plane after a UFO that he seen?
How did we come up with the name Blackbird? Is it true that Kelly Johnson did it? What about a UFO?
I seen a program where Kelly Johnson said that he seen unidentified flying object, and that's where he got the contour of the idea for the plane. He drew it down. Is that true?
So Kelly has supposedly seen a UFO?
They say.
Anybody? The Blackbird, I think maybe just the fact that it was a black airplane and somebody just, I don't know, but as far as Kelly Johnson seeing a UFO, that's news to us.
Yeah,
we know most of us had an opportunity along the way to meet Kelly a time or two. And it was really a great honor, and he's a very sane individual, and I never heard him say anything about UFOs, so I don't know, but.
Well, the reason why I'm going is because my father-in-law used to work for Scottsburg out in Burbank. His name was Jack Hart. I don't know if you guys know him.
Jack Hart, anybody know that name at Burbank?
Anyways, he's the one that kind of told me the story about it.
Wow. Well, that's news to us if that occurred. Kelly's, if you could read Kelly's autobiography, it's called Kelly Johnson, More Than My Share of It All, I think is the name of the book. You can't buy it new anymore, but you might be able to get a used copy of it with Amazon. And I don't remember anything in the book that said anything about that when I read the book. So that's, maybe one of those old wives' tales, I don't know. But question up here.
Yeah, at Boeing Field in Seattle, at the museum, they've got a SR-71 on the ceiling hanging there. And on top of the plane, they've got a smaller one. What's that?
The question is about the airplane that's on display at the Boeing Field just south of Seattle. And it's not actually an SR-71, it's called an M21, and on what's on top of it is a drone. And anybody want to, anybody, Pat, look, Frank, go ahead. What? Pat, you want to talk about the M21?
I don't really know that much about it, except that, like you say, it's not an SR-71. It was a modified A-12 that they added a back cockpit to control the drone and put a pylon on top of the airplane to launch the drone. And it didn't work out all that well. In fact, on one of the test flights, the drone apparently had an unstart as it separated from the airplane in Mach 3 and came back and hit the airplane and destroyed both of them. I think the pilot survived, but the backseater, the flight test engineer or whatever he was, drowned when he landed out off the coast, and so Kelly Johnson canceled the program after that.
And I'm not sure if this is absolute truth. The SR-71 was under development, or the A-12, the first version of the Blackbird was under development. We were smart enough to know that the U-2, which had been overflying the Soviet Union, was going to become vulnerable to their surface-to-air missile technology. So they're designing an airplane that can replace the U-2 and it will be impervious to those surface-to-air missiles. And while it's being developed, unfortunately on May the 1st, 1960, Gary Powers and the U-2 got shot down. And as I understand the story, President Eisenhower was told that the pilot could not have survived what happened. So we can kind of make up a cover story. And so the cover story they came up with was that he was on a weather reconnaissance mission, he had aircraft problems, he inadvertently overflew, and we were so terribly sorry. Well, then the problem with that is that a few days later that we find out that Gary Powers is alive and well, and if maybe somebody can verify this part of it, that they also found the map strip in the cockpit. The wreckage, they found the map strip that showed a line going from Peshawar, Pakistan, all the way through the Soviet Union to Bodo, Norway. And so it's kind of hard now to live by that story. Whether they found the map or not, they found Gary Powers, and he was alive. And one of the outcomes of that was that Eisenhower said that we would not overfly the Soviet Union again with a manned aircraft. So now this A-12 doesn't have a mission because it's manned. So Kelly Johnson, wanting to keep this beautiful dream of an airplane alive, comes up with the idea to put the drone on the back of it. The drone is unmanned. You can release the drone and it can go anywhere you want it to go. It's unmanned. We're keeping our promise. And then it comes out into friendly airspace and ejects its film canister, which is recovered. But as Pat was saying, there were 2 of those that were built, the M21s. They were modified A-12s, and they actually had a fairly successful couple of missions. The drone launched okay, and then they had the accident, and Kelly said, we won't do that anymore. So that airplane, the remaining M21, is now on the display at Webb Field. And we have Pete Laws is back here. Pete is a old Lockheed guy who's got something to tell us. Come up and take the mic, Pete. You got to give me the mic.
I'm just going to tell everybody there's a D-21 sitting right
Oh.
outside there, about 100 yards out.
The drone that was carried on the M21 was called a D-21, and there's one of those on display out of the field.
What happened is after we had the accident, the Bill Clark, the airplane, we decided we were going to continue with the mission. What we did is we put a rocket on the bottom of the D-21 beam, the D-21, and we mounted 2 of them under the wing of the B-52 wing. We launched
Yeah, that was it.
from the wings of the B-52
Had 2 H bombs. He's now blowing 5 on the system.
So it launched at the rocket right up to about 80,000 feet. The rocket would drop off, its engine would start, and all the electronics would come on. It would overfly out, way out, back, and try to catch the package, take it out, and take out the satellite packages eventually. The satellites would let it go. So we would take out the satellites. Anyway, one of the packages came down, and the airplane went back on mission. It landed in the water, and the boat was supposed to come over and retrieve the package, ran the package over, sank the package. And after that, they canceled the program. There were 17 D-21Bs over at Davis Monthan Air Force Base, and they've been giving them out one by one. They gave the guys in Seattle one, and their F-21 was up there in Seattle. One out there in your yard, and one up in the Palmdale and Barron Museum. And there are several other ones around. I'm not sure that they still have.
In my field.
Anyway, there's a lot of things being
My
established.
field.
Now, that's the version they modified them all, so they brought our B-52. So the program did go finally end. So when they had this fiasco trying to catch the package.
Now, I'm sure that you couldn't all hear all of that, so I'm going to repeat it. If you didn't hear it, Pete's saying that after they canceled the M21 D-21 program, the Blackbird that was carrying the drone, they did modify some of those D-21s to launch them off the bottom of the wing off the bottom of B-52s. And how many sorties did they do that with? How many times did you fly it?
5 or 6.
5 or 6.
They were
Okay.
all over Red China.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so some amazing things that they tried to do with that. But another question from somewhere, right over here.
Ballet involved refueling with airspeed and effective speed versus the aircraft's SR-71. Panels talk about some interesting refueling experiences.
Well, the question has to do with our in-flight refueling, and I'll let Pat and Ed address it as well. But from my perspective, the most difficult thing that I think I ever did in the airplane was the night refueling in the weather when you got turbulence and you're bouncing around. And Frank in the back seat had a repeating attitude indicator. And even though I knew that this tanker has not gone inverted, my mind sometimes got so screwed up in those clouds and the bouncing around and all the shaking and whatever. I'd say, Frank, talk to me. Are we wings level? Just confirm our wings level. I knew we were, but I just had to have some reassurance from him looking at the attitude indicator because my concentration was on the bottom of that tanker to maintain my position, and we needed to get the fuel. And so it could really get exciting. And I don't know, Ed, Pat, your experience?
Whenever he asked me that, I always said, "What's it worth to you?"
Yeah, well, yeah, refueling was one of the more difficult parts of flying the airplane. The empty weight of the airplane with no fuel was about 60,000 pounds, but it carried 80,000 pounds of fuel. So we would normally plan our mission so that we would either land or hook up with the next tanker with about 10,000 pounds fuel remaining, which gave you a gross weight of about 70,000 pounds. But you would almost always fill up totally with a tanker. So when you first hooked up and got contact with the boom, you'd be doing about 315 knots or so, normally around 26 or 27,000 feet. And it was standard procedure for the tanker pilot to ease his throttles up to max continuous thrust and just leave them there. So as he offloaded fuel, he could accelerate, but he couldn't accelerate fast enough to stay ahead of what we needed. So by the time you got full fuel, you have just doubled your gross weight from the time you hooked up with the tanker. And he would be going as fast as he could go, and we'd be going as slow as we could go. And we did, well, yeah, we had what they call a toboggan maneuver, where if they needed to, because of hotter temperatures, where the tanker could do it, went a gradual descent so we could pick up the speed. Normally, you didn't need to do that, but it was a very touchy maneuver, and we did lose a couple of airplanes during refueling when they stalled backing off from the tanker after they filled up. So it's a very tricky maneuver, and you got to be very cautious. Sometimes you'd end up with one afterburner flying slightly sideways if the temperature was hotter than standard. So,
Ed, do you want to talk about refueling?
Yeah, that pretty well covers it.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I like, when you were going to light the
And a lot of our missions were slower than 3.2. For one reason, in some places they would like for us to be a little slower so we could make a little tighter turn in some areas. Also, the more time the airplane was above Mach 3.0, it required more frequent maintenance inspections. So also for cost, a lot of missions were planned at Mach 3.0. But at Mach 3.0, if you found that you were getting behind on the fuel curve, behind your fuel plan, you could push it up to 3.2 and gain some fuel, slowly gain some fuel.
only airplane designed to cruise and afterburner did it all day long. That's what it was designed to do. Talking about weights of fuel in the airplane, there was a reference to 80,000 pounds as full tanks. Let me put that in perspective, what 80,000 pounds looks like. You get out here on the freeway and you see a tanker truck going to fill up a local Maverick station or Chevron or whatever, and you got two trailers behind that truck that's pulling it. Those two trailers are 12,000 pounds, which is 12,000 gallons, which is 80,000 pounds. So when you drive by one of those, see one of those guys on the freeway passing you, know that that's what full tanks were in an SR-71, and we could burn it up in an hour and 45 minutes. Questions? We're running out of time, but Patricia. Oh, please. You didn't hear the question, but will you come up and say it on the mic? You did it so well. Come on up here.
Since the SR-71 was top secret, what did you tell your families after your missions when you went home?
I don't remember. Further pain.
Well, originally, it was all top secret. When we first started flying in 68, 69, we went to Okinawa. We didn't tell our families anything, but they were happy to see us when we came back. We were flying over in North Vietnam, and it was, it was really scary, and not scary, but it was concerning, and it was just the way it was, and we were all great together. And we had terrible living conditions. And much later, when I built all the bars, we had more fun.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
Well, also, actually, the existence of the airplane was not classified after President Johnson announced its existence in 1964, but most everything about the airplane was classified. and where we flew was classified. What, you know, the imagery and all was classified. The top speed of the airplane was classified, but the existence of the airplane was not classified, so you could tell your family that you had flown the plane.
Well, they would know, obviously, that we're going to go to Okinawa, and in Okinawa, or England, whichever way we were going, and in Okinawa or England, we were going to fly missions that we didn't share the details of the missions with them. They knew we were flying the SR-71 overseas and in those locations, but we didn't talk about the specifics and what the cities that we might have gone near, or the areas, the places we went. We didn't talk about going up to Murmansk, for instance, or Vladivostok, and just across the sea from Japan and some of those places. But they knew what we were doing, that we were flying missions, but not where or any of their particular details. We're about at it. We got about 5 more minutes. Please, in the back.
What was the maximum amount of photos you took?
Maximum amount of photos? Ooh. Frank? No?
I don't know that.
Lots.
Yeah, I don't know that there's an exact question to that, because we flew with several different variations of sensor packages, intelligence collecting packages. Probably the one that caught the most, would capture the most optical imagery, was the optical bar camera that kind of, the lens kind of swept from horizon to horizon. And the standard figure we had is that with that sensor and a couple of additional pointing type cameras called technical objective cameras, we would cover and image about 100,000 square miles of territory per 1 hour of flight.
In that, did you mention how long that film was on the optical bar camera?
No, because I didn't know.
10,500 feet.
Almost 2 miles worth of film that we could carry in the optical bar camera. It was 10,000 something feet, I think,
Yes.
He's trying to send me a signal. I've lost
We've lost our crew coordination.
Well, we've got to kill him. I think there's something he wants to say at the end. I think he wants to praise me for keeping him alive all those years. I don't know what it is he wants to talk about, but anyway, we've got time for maybe a question or 2 more, and then we'll be ready to end it. Right here, please. How did you hear that? What was the typical mission? How to start out, and where'd you go?
Well, from Okinawa, we used to fly over North Vietnam, and we'd refuel right after takeoff, like we do all missions. And then we go down and fly coast in about Da Nang, turn north over Hanoi, and then refuel. The tanker story is really interesting. They had 3 tankers that take off at 6 in the morning. And they would go down. We usually took off around noon. They go down into Thailand, and they would take refueling fuel from 2 of them, and they would land at Utapao to fly back to Okinawa. The 3rd one would stay for the 2nd loop. We flew 2 loops, and they would refuel the SR, and so it was like 12 tankers that took one mission over North Vietnam.
Hey, Don, why don't you just really quickly run down on what it was like to prep an airplane? How early did you begin before the mission? How many hours before, and how many man hours to do it?
Every mission on the A models, the B model was pretty standard, didn't carry sensors, but the time that you started work depended on the sensor load, and every aircraft was different. We didn't have enough sensors. They didn't keep all the aircraft loaded, so every flight you had to, for example, the nose assembly, it could either be a photo or a radar nose. So if you had a photo nose on and the next flight was a radar, you had to change the nose, configure several different sensors. It carried 9 different types of sensors, and that preparation for that started like the day before in the shops. They would load the cameras and sensors up, come out and load it on the aircraft. And at about the pre-flight inspection was set up for 5 people, 4 mechanics and a crew chief. It took about 6 hours to do the pre-flight, we would, well, let me regress just a moment. Just prior to that, we'd refuel the aircraft. We wouldn't service a liquid nitrogen because of the fuel leaks. We do that just before the crew got in the aircraft. But sensor load would start the day before, and then the refueling and the pre-flight, post-flight would be about 8 hours prior to flight. So you'd be pretty busy during that time.
Not an easy airplane to prep for flight. I need to make one statement, and then I'm going to let Frank do whatever it was he was going to do, and then I'll have one final quick thing. We want the maintenance guys to know and the tanker guys to know that we didn't have a mission without them. They had the airplanes ready to fly every time they were supposed to be ready. The tankers never had a tanker not show up where he was supposed to be and when he was supposed to be there. And so people they're aware of the SR-71, and he gets a lot of the notoriety. But behind the scenes, these maintenance guys and these tanker guys were the ones that were the lifeblood. I mean, they're the ones that without them, our missions didn't do anything. And so we owe a big debt to the tanker and the maintenance guys. And I don't know if any tanker guys are here, but I know we got some maintenance troops, and I want to give you a hand, Doc.
Hey, we got some in the audience too. Why don't you guys stand up if you can? I know, Robbie, you can't.
Let's see the maintenance guys. Let's have all the maintenance guys stand. Thank you, guys. Okay, Frank, your whatever it is, your
Just real quickly, I'm kind of surprised nobody followed up with this question. But when Ed gave his very poignant description of his cross-country record-breaking flight, he used the term that they were cruising across country at faster than a bullet. And a lot of folks really don't have a good appreciation, even aviators, when you talk in terms of Mach numbers and knots and all that. You know it's fast. 2,000 miles an hour is very fast. Mach 3 is fast, but you don't have a real good day-to-day analogy. And a couple of those engineers that worked with Kelly Johnson once did a back-of-the-napkin calculation that I later verified. And they said if you could set up a theoretical race between the SR-71 and a 30-06 rifle bullet, and you could have both of those, the rifle aimed from, let's say, overhead Los Angeles, aimed toward New York, and you had the SR-71 go over LA, kind of like not over LA, but near LA, like Ed did, and you had them go at the same time, and you allowed the bullet to maintain its muzzle velocity, not slow down for friction or anything like that, gravity, that the SR-71 would get to New York 3.5 minutes before the bullet. And I think that's something that really you got to carry away when Ed was taking that airplane to be retired. It's pretty crazy, but it's really a pretty remarkable fact.
And you all thought Superman was the only thing that was faster than a speeding bullet.
Ed, one last one.
See, this is still on. I wanted to add one more thing. I wanted to say a while ago that my RSO was J.T. Vita, just a tremendous guy. I just loved flying with him and working for him. He had more time in the airplane than any other crew member. He had 1,392.7 hours in the airplane. Just an outstanding RSO. Great friend, we all miss him. He, 2.5 years after we flew our record flight, he passed away with cancer. And we all remember J.T. Vita.
Yeah, very much so. Well, let me just thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to us rant. We appreciate the opportunity to share our stories with you. Appreciate your interest in the SR-71, and I want to tell you that there's more things going on at the museum today. I'm sure Patricia would love it if you bought programs, if you bought shirts, if you bought posters, if you supported the museum. They're doing a great job here, and there are other things happening. There are 2 more panel presentations today. I have to congratulate you on coming to this panel, though, because it's by far the best one that you'll see this weekend. And but there are 2 other subpar panels this afternoon and 2 tomorrow. And enjoy the rest of your day around the museum. And thank you for being here. And again, thanks for your interest.